This episode goes out to our patron, Mark Monroe. Thanks for being an OG supporter, Mark. Hi there, Garrett Robinson here. Welcome to the 20th episode of the Nightblade Epic Podcast Season 3. Hey listener, I hope you're having a great holiday season. These episodes are recorded in advance, so right now I'm probably off relaxing with my family, and I hope you're lucky enough to have some peace and love as well. I love producing and putting out this show every week, and if you want to help make it easier, you should check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/GarrettB.Robinson. My patrons are a big part of why I'm able to do everything I do, write fantasy books, create this podcast, and make my YouTube videos. If you become a supporter, you get all kinds of cool benefits. You can see my writing process as it happens, and even get free copies of my books. Right now, I'm trying to reach 100 supporters on Patreon. When I do, to celebrate, I'm going to commission some new Underrealm character art to share with you and everyone else out there in the community. And then you get to help me decide on our next goal. To support me for just $1 a month, or more than $1 a month, go over to patreon.com/GarrettB.Robinson. That's patreon.com/GarrettB.Robinson. Okay, now it's time for today's episode. Today, you're getting chapter 28 of Darkfire. When we left off, Lauren and her friends were under attack from Triskin and the Shades. Enjoy! Darkfire, Chapter 28. To either side of Triskin walked the bodyguards Lauren had seen at his dais, and before him marched a half-dozen stronghold soldiers. They made no attempt to hide behind cover as they advanced, though the soldiers in front glanced uneasily at each other. Triskin paid them no mind. "Well, he is an ugly one," said Albern, raising his bow and drawing. His shaft struck one soldier in the chest. The others flinched and made to stop, but Triskin's guards shoved them forwards. The soldiers raised shields, but against Albern they might as well have had no protection at all. Twice again his arrows struck, and twice again killed. That made them duck at last behind the edges of the cave mouth. "Back!" said Lauren. She seized Jem and Annis and tried to pull them farther into the caves. "No," said Jordell. "We cannot flee without leaving Zane and the horses behind. It will be a fight." He drew his sword and stepped forwards. "Ah, and we could use more than 2 blades," said Albern, looking at Lauren sidelong. "I will help," said Jem, though his voice quivered as he said it. He reached for the small sword Jordell had given him, buckled to his waist. "Do not be a fool," said Lauren, grabbing his wrist as he drew and shoving the blade back in. "You will be slaughtered." "He will likely be slaughtered in any case if they get through Jordell and me," said Albern. "Let the boy die with a sword in his hand if he wants." "I told you I would not ask you to kill," said Jordell, "and I will not do so now. But if we do not fight, then likely we will all die here." Lauren looked at the cave mouth where the soldiers' heads could be seen poking into view, no doubt goaded by Triskin and his men. Even Jem meant to take up a blade in their defense, and Annis had stooped to pick up a rock from the ground, holding it ready to throw. There was a shout from the mouth of the cave, and the soldiers rushed them, with Triskin coming close behind. There was no more time for thought. Lauren ran to Midnight and seized her bow from the saddle and then turned with a shaft already drawn. She planted one arrow in a man's leg. Albern, without any such compunction, slew one of the bodyguards with a shaft through the eye. 2 soldiers remained, as well as Triskin and 1 bodyguard. Albern drew his sword, and he and Jordell met the Shades in battle. Beside them came Jem, thin voice raised in a cry, but one of the Shades struck out with a mighty fist, and Jem was dashed aside into the cave wall, where he slumped to the ground. Jordell and Albern traded blows with their opponents, backing up a step at a time. Lauren drew her dagger, but the cave walls pressed too tight, and she could not find a place to step in. She was not even sure her blade would help against the longer weapons of their foes. But the narrow space also forced Triskin to hold back. The bodyguard nearly broke Albern's defense, and Lauren was about to go to his aid. Then from nowhere a rock flew into the bodyguard's temple. Lauren saw Annis's empty hand. The moment's distraction gave Albern an opening. His sword found its mark at last, plunging through chainmail and into the guard's gut. As the woman died, Albern stepped past her and cut down one of Jordel's opponents as well. Jordel pounced as the last shade tried to flee. His stolen sword plunged into the man's back. Before he could withdraw it, Triskin stepped around his henchman and struck with the hilt of his hammer, driving the pommel hard into Jordel's chest. The mystic fell to his back with a great whoosh of air and curled up, clutching his chest where he had been struck. Albern leaped to his defense, trying to keep Triskin at bay, but the stronghold commander forced him back as easily as if he were Jem, before turning back to Jordel. "No!" Lauren could restrain herself no longer. She scooped up Jem's sword and leaped at Triskin, swinging wildly. She wished suddenly that she had taken the chance to learn sword fighting. Even to her, the strike seemed clumsy. But they gave Triskin just enough pause for Jordel to find his feet again, and he pressed forwards beside her while Albern circled around from behind. They had Triskin surrounded in the center of the cave, his head turning back and forth to keep them all in sight. Lauren held her sword awkwardly before her. Albern moved to strike, but Triskin turned the blade aside with his hammer. He used the advantage to step back and around the bowyer, putting his back to the cave wall. The air grew quiet in a sudden lull. Only the rain outside and the heavy breathing of the fighters could be heard. Triskin's eyes sought out their faces one by one, studying them. Then he looked past them to where Jem lay crumpled on the floor, and where Annis knelt beside him. A cruel look of recognition slid over his face. "No," he chuckled. "No, this cannot be. This is too wonderful." He threw back his head and laughed loud and long, the deep, terrible sound echoing off the walls of the cave, until it became a choir of dark voices all joining in his mirth. "If you call dying in a cave wonderful, then you are a madman," said Albern. Triskin acted as if he had not heard. His eyes were still only for Annis, his lips split in a wide grin. "The Yeren girl. I thought finding you for your mother would be difficult. How could I have imagined you would walk into my arms? The Lord will be most pleased." Annis's eyes filled with fright, and she clutched Jem's unconscious form a little tighter. "Yes, I will bring you to your mother shortly, after I have dealt with these." Triskin's gaze went to Lauren. "You must be the other one, the mystic spy who stole her away, the one some call Nightblade. Your corpse will make the Lord a fine gift, I think." Thinking him distracted, Jordel lunged, but Triskin sidestepped the blow, moving far more quickly than such a large man should, batting the sword aside with his hilt. He turned the movement into a swing that came speeding towards Lauren's head, and she barely ducked in time. Triskin fell back into a fighting pose, and kept speaking as if nothing had happened. "And you, I can smell the stench of a mystic upon you. The outcast. Where is your fallen wizard, Jordel? Ah, there he is upon the floor." He laughed again, shaking his great head slowly. "What marvelous fortune for me, and for the Lord, whom fortune shall always favor. But how tragic for you, to come so far only to find death in the great rocks." Lauren had an idea. If she could distract the man, it might give Albern and Jordel a chance to bring him down. Certainly she could do no more good than that, for she was no fighter. As Triskin began to speak again, Lauren leaped forwards with a cry, bringing her sword down in a heavy overhand swing. Triskin's warhammer swung to meet it, and Lauren's sword rang painfully in her hand. Then one leg came up, his plated knee smashing into her ribs. Lauren cried out and fell, but before she could reach the ground, Triskin brought the hilt around again, sending the pommel crashing down between her shoulder blades. Jordell attacked with a wordless roar of fury, smashing the warhammer aside and driving forwards with another strike, pressing in close where Triskin could not bring his weapon to bear. That barely gave the commander pause. He seized the front of Jordell's tunic in one meaty fist and drew him forwards, slamming his forehead into Jordell's nose. But that gave Albern the chance he needed. His blade found its home deep in the back of Triskin's knee, the bloodied tip of it exploding through the front of the man's leg and shoving away the plate. Triskin sank down with a grunt, but in a desperate final attempt, he raised his hammer above Jordell's chest. Albern's sword swung around and nearly clove his arm in two, hacking through skin and muscle and into the bone. Triskin's hammer fell useless, his arm limp and wasted. Jordell rose, dagger in hand, and plunged it to the hilt in Triskin's neck. The giant fell at last, face down on the cave floor, his blood pooling around him to mix with the rainwater. Lauren rolled onto her back, gasping for air, and winced as she landed on a rock just where the pommel of Triskin's warhammer had struck her. Slowly she was able to gain her hands and knees. Her fingers prodded at her ribs. The bones were certainly bruised, but they did not feel broken. At least she hoped not, for then she had no idea how she could make it out of the great rocks alive. She could do nothing more than crawl, so she made her way to Jem on the other side of the cave. Annis was already there, holding his head in her lap and looking down into his face. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks. "He lives," she said. "I can feel his breath. He is only hurt." "Good," said Lauren, "but he needs to wake. We must flee now." "He knew me, Lauren," said Annis, her voice breaking. "He knew who I was. He knew my mother." "She wanted his assistance searching for you," said Lauren. "I will tell you all of it, everything we have learned, but later. For now, rest easily. He is dead, and it no longer matters what he knew." Lauren shook Jem by the shoulders. Still his eyes remained closed. She slapped his face, gently at first and then harder. Finally she went to a dip in the cave floor, where water had pooled as if in a bowl. She scooped it up in both hands, then dropped it onto Jem's face. He came up sputtering. "What happened?" he said weakly. His words were slurred by thick lips, for a large bruise was already covering most of the left side of his face. "You were struck down in the fight," said Lauren. "But you fought bravely." "Of course I did," Jem grunted. He froze, his eyes widening in terror as he looked beyond Lauren and Annis. Lauren whirled just in time to see Triskin rise to his knees. His mangled right arm still hung limp by his side, but with his left he seized Jordell's cloak and dragged him down. His arm wrapped around the mystic's throat, squeezing tight as he throttled the life out of him. "Stinking mystic," hissed Triskin, voice bubbling with blood through his torn throat. "All your kind are doomed, but I am content to start with you." Albern flung himself forwards, sinking his knife into Triskin's neck again. The commander only laughed. Albern withdrew the knife and plunged it into the man's spine. Triskin only laughed harder, while Jordell's face grew purple and Lauren heard a weak rattle escape from his throat. She ran to seize Triskin's wrist and pull his arm away from the mystic, but she may as well have tried to move a mountain. The bowyer stuck the knife into Triskin's eye, the blade sinking 6 fingers deep into the man's brain. His whole body went slack at once, his arm finally falling away, and he sank to the ground once more. Lauren pulled Jordell away from the body, where he fell to his face on the ground. He gave great, wheezing gasps of air, sucking it down like sweet wine. "What manner of witchery was that?" cried Annis. "He was dead! Jordell killed him!" Albern shrugged, stooping to wipe his dagger clean on Triskin's cloak. "Do not think too much of it. In war I have seen men fight on through worse. but not a dagger in the eye. It is over now." Jordell forced himself up. "We must leave." His voice was a horrible rasp. "More will come when their commander fails to return." "Indeed," said Albern. "Strange that he would even risk himself out here when he has a whole garrison at his back. But no matter. Where will we go? The west road and the east will both be watched. Farther into the caves?" "No," said Jordell. "Once they find his body, they will send their whole strength to scour this place. We have but one choice. We must go into the fort itself." "You are mad," said Jem, voice shaking. "He is not," said Lauren. "There is a place we can hide, but Jordell, what then? It hardly seems a better hiding spot than this, and still we have no means of escape." "I do not yet know," said Jordell. "Only we cannot remain here." "But the horses," said Lauren. "They will not fit into the secret entrance. What will we do with them?" "We must abandon them," said Jordell. "Bring everything from the saddles that you can, and leave the rest." Lauren felt her heart seize up. She looked far back into the cave, where Midnight still stood hobbled with the other horses. The plow horse and Albern's bay nickered and danced at all the bloodshed, but Midnight stood stock still, her gaze fixed on Lauren. The thought of leaving the mare made Lauren want to weep. More than a month they had spent on the road together, until Midnight seemed as much a friend as Annis or Jem did. "Do not despair," said Jordell, seeing the look on her face. "We may yet have a chance to recover them. The soldiers within the stronghold will no doubt bring the horses in for themselves, and from there we might rescue them." The odds against that seemed strong, but Lauren did not say so. She only nodded, for she knew he was right. With heavy hearts they all went to their saddlebags and fetched their provisions, waterskins, and bedrolls. Albern stroked his horse's mane for a moment. Then he removed its hobbles and gave it a pat on the neck. Lauren spent a little while holding her forehead against Midnight's muzzle. The mare turned and nudged her, as though she could sense Lauren's distress. Meanwhile, Jordell went to Zane, bound hand and foot on the cave floor. The wizard had watched the whole fight in silence, for a gag still bound his mouth. Now Jordell hauled him up to his feet and looked solemnly into his eyes. "I'm going to unbind your feet, and you will come with us," said Jordell. "If you should try to flee, you will die. Even if you should escape my grasp, the soldiers within the stronghold will find and kill you. Do you understand?" Zane nodded, neither eager nor fearful. Lauren remembered the brief words he had had with her, his apology that had seemed so sincere. She found herself wanting to believe those words now, to have some assurance that his time of madness had passed. But still, she was not eager to break the bonds that held his hands, nor to remove the gag from his mouth. They stood at the cave mouth, ready to emerge into the rain. But then, just before Jordell took his first step beyond the opening, Lauren heard the scrape of metal on stone. She looked back and froze. There on the cave floor, Triskin moved. His boot slid slowly on the floor as he tried to bring it up beneath him. His arms sought for purchase on the stone, both of them, the right and the left. Even as she watched, the torn flesh and skin of his right arm stitched together, as though under the hands of a seamstress. The hole where his eye had been was sealed over with skin, and it bubbled and rippled like a boiling kettle. "Jordell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Run," said Jordell. "Run, now!" They fled out into the rainy night as quickly as their legs could carry them. This has been a production of Legacy Books, written and narrated by Garrett Robinson. The music in this podcast was created by Will Musser. Check out his incredible work at willmusser.com. That's WILLMUSSER.com. Today's letter is I. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.